Well, I am delighted to say that joining me on the Godcast this week is Jason Romano. Now, Jason may not be ultra familiar to people in the UK, but he's a successful author. He's a speaker and media professional from America, and he's had over 25 years of broadcasting and media experience. So, Jason, it's really wonderful to get you on the Godcast. First of all, whereabouts are you in America?
Yeah, it's wonderful to be here. I am in Bristol, Connecticut, so probably 2 hours, a little northeast of New York City, to give people kind of a place on the map. Central
Yeah.
Connecticut.
And what is that a hotbed of sport for? Jason is an experienced sports media professional. What goes down there in Bristol over there?
Well, they have a little media company called ESPN, which I'm sure even those in the UK would have heard of and know about. So ESPN, when they were creating their company back in 1979, they settled on Bristol, Connecticut, here right where I live, probably 10 minutes from where I am right now, to begin broadcasting. And the reason was because it was kind of in between Boston and in between New York City. And so it gave you a close proximity to two pretty big sports towns, but it was founded by a guy who lived in that area, and they were looking for wide open spaces to be able to build on. It's hard to find that in larger cities. So ESPN settled in Bristol, Connecticut, because they've been able to build out this campus, this compound, to obviously now it's been 44 years to be able to broadcast and become one of the biggest media companies in the world and the biggest sports media company maybe ever.
Yeah, and your pathway to media, Jason, was that something that you wanted to do from childhood? Did you go through university to specialize in that area?
Yeah, I did. When I was a kid, especially when my childhood, I kind of joke that when I was born, I was born out of the womb to watch sports. That's all I cared about as a kid. I wasn't a very religious kid or spiritual growing up. I went to church here and there, but sports was my cathedral. Sports was my God. Sports was what I worshiped. And, I look back now and I think, okay, that was probably a little misguided, but I'm thankful because I believe God gave me that passion for sports for a reason. And it allowed me to, like you say, go into the university, go to college and study journalism, study broadcasting. When I realized that I couldn't play sports, Alex, professionally, the next best thing to me was to talk about it and to go into that world of broadcasting and media. And that's what I did. And I picked a couple of local colleges here in New York State, outside of Connecticut. I grew up in upstate New York, Albany, New York, which is about 2 hours north of New York City. I grew up there. And so I went to a couple colleges that were in that area that had, pretty good media programs, broadcasting programs. And I was fortunate, when I got out of college many years ago, I was able to get a job in local radio for 3 years before I ended up at ESPN.
Local radio, even in the UK, is a great gateway, isn't it, into the world of media? Just a few recollections of that time of your life, Jason.
I love that time of my life for a couple of reasons. Number one, it was the most fun still to this day. This is 26 years ago, 25 years ago. Still to this day, it's the most fun I've ever had in broadcasting because, I was young. I was 23, 24 years old, just starting out, trying to find my way, just happy that somebody was actually paying me some amount of money to be able to do what I dreamed about doing. And it wasn't sports, it was kind of a local, I don't know what you call it, like a news magazine type morning show that I was working on. So we would cover all the local events and, travel to some of the local events. And there was a little politics in there, a little news item, fun, entertainment, and a little sports as well. But I had so much fun. And the guy that I was working with at the time, he's now since passed. His name is Don Weeks. He was a local legend, which I'm sure anywhere around the world, if you have local radio, there's these guys that, you grow up listening to. They're the voices of your childhood, the voices that you listen to every day. And he was that guy for so many. And so for me to be able to work with him for 2 years was the greatest classes of media I could ever have. Forget going to college. Working with this guy taught me so much about the business of broadcasting and media. He taught me to have fun and not to take ourselves too seriously. But he also taught me how to live life and to understand that, life is short and to do the best that you can. Now, at that time, my spiritual life was not there. I wasn't a follower of Jesus or kind of walking in faith at all at that time. But those were all kind of things I think God was planting seeds at that time of just preparing me. And those early days were so much fun. I mean, we would come on the radio every morning and just laugh our butts off, and it was so much fun. So I missed those times because it was, many years ago, and certainly to be younger would have been, it's always a fun time of life. But, at that time I was just starting to date my now wife at that time. We didn't have kids yet. I was just trying to, make enough money to be able to live on my own apartment. It was just different times than where we are now. But I'm so grateful for those early years, for sure.
You just touched on your own faith and not being quite there, but you mentioned some of the seeds. What were the seeds, Jason?
I think the seeds were, it's funny. They weren't seeds of faith. I think they were seeds of trying to be, as good a person as I could be, trying to understand that there were bigger things in life than just my job. These are small seeds that now, as a devout follower of Jesus, who's read the Bible and studied the Bible and walked with the Lord for 20 years, now I see this is all part of God's plan. So I wouldn't say that he was planting seeds of, scripture or anything like that in me. I think my brother Chris was, which we can get into that in a little bit. But I think from work perspective, it was just trying to how to carry yourself, maturing. New Testament talks about, spiritual milk that we crave, and we're not kids anymore. We're adults, in the sense of being followers of Christ, more mature in our faith. I think I was just learning how to be more mature as a human being during that time. 23 years old. I was around a guy who once told me, Alex, you'll like this quote. He said, "Everybody gets old, but you can remain immature forever." And so this is a guy who also, when I said he taught me how to laugh and not take myself too seriously. Now that I'm going to be 50 years old in about a month, I can attest to being older, but also understanding that I'm not trying to be immature per se, but I'm trying to laugh and have fun and understand that life is short.
Yeah.
And if we take it too seriously, I think it's gonna backfire a little bit.
I think it's a great quote. I've recently turned 54, and and being an Anglican priest, there's a level of expectation from the clergy and from the congregations. But I think I'm quite immature at heart, and sometimes I need to be reminded of that, because it does brings out a good side of me that I enjoy myself to participate in, so.
Yeah. Well, Jesus talks about a childlike faith, right? Like that we're really all supposed to approach him in many ways like a child. And I think there's truth to that, because children are immature and they're, silly and fun and goofy and all those things. And I think if, obviously our faith is serious, something we're supposed to take seriously, but I think there is a child within all of us, whatever age we get to, that we still yearn to kind of revisit every so often. So I know that for me, I try to do that.
I totally agree. I think sometimes I sometimes remind people that that God gave us the gift of humor, the gift of a sense of fun, and sometimes we underestimate that, particularly as we come out of COVID and all the horrible experience of that. I think it's really important to remember and reiterate to people.
I could not agree more. I think it's so important to remember where you came from. It's important to remember what was that like when you were 9 years old?
Yeah.
And what brought you the most joy, and to revisit that a little bit as you get older.
Yeah.
You being in the UK, one of my favorite joys that has nothing to do with Jesus or Christianity, but I love the Beatles. And so whenever I hear the Beatles, they bring me joy. I listen to them a lot and they bring me joy, but it reminds me of being younger and being at my house with my dad who would play Sergeant Pepper's, and there's the music, and it's like, okay, that takes me back to those moments. So I think there's nothing wrong with that. I think God births that within us, and I think we need to, again, not take ourselves too seriously in those moments, and it's okay to go back and, you know, be a little kid again every so often.
Now, this period working in local radio, did you see the great lights of ESPN on the horizon? Was this the game plan? Was this intentional? Just tell us how that all came about, because over 25 years you worked for the organization. Is that right?
Well, 17 at ESPN, but 25 years in broadcasting, but still a long time.
Yeah.
It wasn't on the radar. I mean, if you talked to me or met me when I was 16 years old, I would have told you I want to be a sports broadcaster. In fact, my yearbook in high school, they have quotes for, you know, your senior year, and the quote in my yearbook said, class of 1991, Jason Romano, and then the quote, to be the greatest sports broadcaster since Howard Cosell, who was a very famous broadcaster in the 70s and 60s in the United States, even into the early 80s. So my mindset was always like, wouldn't that be the coolest thing, to be an amazing broadcaster at that level? But I don't think I really dreamed or even had in the game plan to go to ESPN, because when I got out of college, I just wanted a job in broadcasting. And I was so grateful. It took me about 4 months after I graduated to get that job in local radio. It was WGY Radio in Albany, New York. I don't think I mentioned the call letters. So at WGY, if you'd have told me at that time that I would have just worked there forever and spent 30 years at that station, I don't think I would have complained. I would probably have said, yeah, that's amazing. Did I have this yearning to do sports? Yes, that was for sure. But I think even when I liken it to sports, right? Like if you're a baseball player and you grow up and you root for your favorite baseball team and you play little league baseball, like kids baseball, right? Youth baseball. And you're dreaming about being in the big leagues and being the next great baseball player. That's normal. Like that's kind of where I was with broadcasting. Like it'd be great but realistically, it's probably not going to happen. But that dream is always kind of there. And so for me, realistically, I just thought, okay, I can probably get a job in local radio. Maybe I could go into local television or something. Maybe I can do some local sports. But ESPN was not in the plans or the cards. It actually came about, Alex, by just the early days of the internet. This is the late 90s. I think actually this was early 2000, the first year, 2000, March or April of 2000. I saw a job listing on the internet for an ESPN radio producer job. And I looked at it and I said, okay, first of all, that's ESPN. That's amazing. Second of all, it's producing. That's what I've been doing for 3 years. And third of all, it's a job opening that requires, at least on paper, that I have 5 years of broadcasting experience. I only had 3. They're looking for 5 years of network experience. I only had 3 years of local experience. But the knucklehead, I guess, in me just didn't care about that and went right to the internet and said, I'm going to apply for this job. Why not? And I applied for it, not thinking that I would get it, not even thinking that I'd get a call, but just thinking, why not? What's the worst that could happen? Nobody calls me back. I love the job I'm doing now. Here we go. Well, I remember going home to my wife, who we had just gotten married a few months earlier, and I said, hey, I just want you to know that I applied for a job at ESPN today. They're probably going to call. I'm probably going to say yes, and we're probably going to have to move to Connecticut. But I said that jokingly, Alex. There's no way I really believed that. And she just looked at me with this bizarre face and said, what are you talking about? I said, well, you know, ESPN job popped up on the internet and I applied for it. I don't think I'm going to get it, but I just want you to know that I applied for it. And we kind of just filed it in the back of our minds for about a month and a half. And then they called. Couldn't believe it. Hey, it's ESPN. Hey, Jason, we want you to come out to Bristol, Connecticut and interview for the job. And I went out and I got the job and we moved to Connecticut. And that was in July. My first day was July 18th, 2000. And when I got there, Alex, it was like we talked about that childlike faith. It was like being a 10-year-old all over again. And it was great. And I walked in there and I said, I can't believe I'm watching and seeing and working with my heroes in many ways. The people I watch on ESPN, I've watched since I was a kid. So yeah, it was like that. And for most of my 17 years there, it was like that. Like it was going in every day and saying, I can't believe I get to do this job at this place. It was pretty cool.
Well, you're answering my next question, because I was going to say, was the dream, was the reality as good as the dream? And it sounds like it was. What were the highlights?
Yeah, for the most part, the reality was as good as the dream. I mean, at the same time, in fact, I would say it actually exceeded any kind of dreams that I had, because working at a place is one thing, but interacting with the people who I watched I became friends with the people that I watched. I became friends with people who I idolized and rooted for in sports as a kid, my sports heroes, which is just crazy. So my highlights, I mean, the first one, it's not really a highlight, but it's a memorable moment, was just working on 9/11, which was a day, here in the States that everybody knows about, in 2001. And I had only been at ESPN for about a year or so. And then this monumental moment happens. And I think you just think back to where you were, what you were doing at that time, but then thinking about your job. And, we didn't go on the air on September 11th because all of ESPN's programming was shut off, just so that we could cover this, this horrific event that took place. But the next day we went on the air, September 12th, 2001. And that's a day I'll always remember, because it was the first day of broadcasting any kind of sports news after this moment that affects the entire world, not just the United States. And, I just remember thinking how, this was sort of a baptism by fire. Nobody really knew what they were doing, and they kind of threw us in and said, okay, just try to be as tasteful and as tactful and as sensitive and empathetic as you can in how you cover this event. And all we did was we just talked to sports people about their feelings on the event. So we didn't talk sports. We just had the voices that you normally would hear at ESPN come on and talk about their own feelings, their own thoughts, their own reactions, where they were. It was surreal. It was a very surreal day. There were many other great moments. I've gotten to cover, large events in the American, lexicon of sports, like the Super Bowl, like the World Series, like the NBA Finals, and just going and being at these events. You talk about childhood, dreams, like for people to pay me to go to these events and cover them. I would pay lots of money on my own to go to these events and cover them, and I'm being paid. So it's 17 years. There's so many memories. I think that September 12th, 2001 kind of stands out as one I don't talk a lot about, but it's definitely a memorable one.
And where were you? And so as your career evolves, tell us about how your faith evolves as well, Jason, and which ultimately leads you to leaving ESPN, doesn't it? Just take us through that cycle, if you would.
Yeah. So I grew up going to St. Patrick's Catholic Church in Ravenna, New York, which is a small town near Albany, a couple hours north of New York City. But I didn't really pay attention. I didn't care about church. My grandfather took me. So if you want to talk about seed planting, that was certainly a moment when I was a young boy going to church with my grandfather. But fast forward, once I became, in my teenage years and adolescent years, I kind of just decided I don't want to have anything to do with church or God. I wasn't anti-God. I just didn't care. Like I said, my sports and fandom of sports, that was my God. And that's what I worshiped. But in 2001, thanks to my brother, Chris, who was the first in our family to really get serious about his faith in Jesus, he invited me to his church. And it was a different type of church. It was if you know, Father Alex, about the Pentecostal world, a denomination, it was a very charismatic, energetic church, much different than what I grew to know and see. And I was definitely out of place when I walked in there.
Yeah.
But I said yes because it was Mother's Day and my mom was in town and my brothers were going. So we all kind of just went to my brother's church. And, the singing and the clapping and the music, that was a little different for me. I wasn't quite adept to that at first, but the message, which is really what it is. I don't care what church you go to. It's the message. As long as they're preaching the gospel, it's the message. And the gospel was preached that day. Now, I didn't have this moment where I was invited to say yes to Jesus at this church, but it was a seed that was planted pretty quickly. It grew because it was just a couple hours later that my brother Chris asked me, he said, "What do you think about the service that you went to?" We were at his house just hanging out on Mother's Day. And I said, the service was a little different for me, Chris, a little weird, but I enjoyed the message. It was interesting. And he goes, "Well, can you come back with me for a second?" I said, "Sure." So we went back to the back bedroom of his house and he introduced me to Jesus. He just said, "Hey, point blank, can I tell you about the gospel of Jesus? It's been something that's changed my life the last 3 years. I'd love to tell you more about it." And I said, "Yes." Now my heart was open that day, Alex, and I tell people all the time, I was not one who had studied the Bible. I hadn't gone through seminary. I didn't go through all of the classes or whatever it is to be, certified as a Christian per se. But my heart was open to say yes when he asked me if I was interested in pursuing a relationship with Jesus. I said yes. And that started what now is 22 years later, this journey, which is always what I think it is. I don't think anybody ever fully gets it or is, perfectly fit to be a Christian. We all sin. Romans 8:5-8, I think, says all are sinners and fall short of the glory of God. Now, it doesn't mean you have to live in that sin anymore, which is what I believe, that once Jesus comes into our life, that's why he went to the cross, that he took care of that sin and paid that penalty for us. But I've been on this journey for 22 years of pursuing God and learning more about him. You mentioned, what was that like during my time at ESPN? Well, it was an interesting time because even though I said yes that day on Mother's Day 2001, it took many, many years before I even was able to say God is number one in my life, because that wasn't the case for probably a good decade. It was still my job, or it was my wife, or it was my daughter who was born in 2004. It was all of these things, which are all in some ways good things. But if you replace those good things with God, those can actually become bad things. They can become idols, not bad things per se, but idols, false gods, if you will. And so it took me about 10 years till I realized that I was a follower of Christ first, before I was an ESPN producer or a husband or a dad. I used to have that backwards. I used to think, I'm an ESPN producer who happens to be a Christian, or happens to be a follower of Christ. And it was probably in 2012, 13 area where I said, no, you know what? I'm starting to understand now my identity cannot fall into something that's fleeting like ESPN. I thought I would work there forever. Clearly, I don't work there anymore. So my identity couldn't be in that, because that's going to end. It had to be in something, some kind of firm foundation, as Jesus talks about. I think it's you would tell me better, but I think it's in Matthew 5 or Matthew 6, when he talks about putting our firm foundation on solid rock. He's the solid rock. And so that's what I realized. And it's helped me understand that my identity is in Christ first. And, I continued to work at ESPN for a few more years, but ultimately it led me to leaving ESPN and pursuing sports ministry, which was something I never even thought about or realized could exist, but that I could combine my passion for sports and my passion for God and help reach people for his kingdom. That's just ridiculous when I think about it, many years later, but it's where God has me now, and I love it.
I think there's something really important, Jason, in what you're saying there. Because I think whether you're on your side of the Atlantic or on my side of the Atlantic, I think there's a lot of Christians or a lot of people who are intrigued by the message and the stories and the Gospels, but they feel unless they go completely dive in, then they're in some way they're failing, and in my context, where I work on some of the urban estates in Lancashire, in the northwest of England, people listening in the UK will know about. We find that people have got quite a lot of baggage that they bring with them to the church. And one of those key things that I want to ask you about and that I experience is people's desire to forgive, but find it difficult to forgive. So they can say, yeah, I can love Jesus, but I've got all this baggage. And you actually wrote a book, didn't you, called Live to Forgive. So can you just share a little bit of that with us, Jason? Just bearing in mind we're up against the clock, but just, a few thoughts there, please, because I think it's really important what you're saying.
Yeah, the key nugget to my book, Live to Forgive, and it's about my story of forgiving my alcoholic father. I won't go deep into that story for timing purposes, but what I discovered was that I had a lot of baggage, right? And that I understood forgiveness from God because I had to ask him, hey, forgive me of my sins. It's right there in the Lord's Prayer. Forgive us our sins as we forgive those who trespass against us. That second part of the Lord's Prayer is very difficult, as we forgive those who trespass against us. That is not easy. And I had not forgiven my dad for many years, even though I had to ask God to forgive me, because I was hanging on to bitterness and anger. I didn't think he deserved to be forgiven for the pain that he had caused me. But what I realized when you search the scriptures, that I basically was doing to my dad what ultimately God, if he chose to do, could do to me, because I didn't do a lot of things well. And I probably didn't deserve forgiveness from God for the mistakes that I made either. But yet he grants that to us freely. He gives it to us if we ask for it. And so who am I to try and play God to my dad and say, you don't deserve forgiveness for what you've done for me? Because forgiveness is not about the other person. Alex, forgiveness is for ourselves. And if we don't forgive, first of all, it's a command from Jesus. Number one, if you're going to be a follower of Christ, we are commanded to forgive every single time that we've been wrong, because he does that for us. But the second is, who am I to play God? My dad and I are the same person in the eyes of God. We're the same person. And I think when I hold on to that bitterness and anger, I'm the one that's trapped in this cesspool of hate, I think, in some ways, that doesn't allow us to be free. I truly believe that
what did that
we
do,
are free.
Jason, when you, because I keep saying to people, you've got to forgive. And it was so hard, but just tell us, in your capacity, in your experience, by letting that go, what was the benefit of that for you? What was the consequence?
Yeah, I always say people tell us all the time, forgive and forget. Well, you never forget. If we have a brain in our head, we're not going to forget the pain that was caused. But what it allowed me to do was to move forward. That's actually the subtitle of the book, Moving Forward When Those We Love Hurt Us. To forgive means to be able to move forward freely in Christ and understand that, okay, I'm giving this to God. And what it did for me was it allowed me to be free, Alex. It allowed me to walk in freedom, not to necessarily try to reconcile with anyone that's ever wronged me, or my dad in this case. Thankfully, we have reconciled, but it's not to be reconciled with him. It's to be reconciled to God. And ultimately, forgiving my dad was for me, not for my dad. My dad could have still chose to make those decisions. And unfortunately, recently, he's landed back in some of the stuff that he, struggled with for many years. But he's trying to get better. But my forgiveness can't be predicated on my dad's actions.
Well, I've got to ask you then, Jason, but is it easier for you to minister to him or to be his son now where you are in your life? Or is it still, I'm sure it's still, I'm not even going to ask if it's still a challenge. I know it is, but just, is it different?
It's very different. I think, first of all, I'm more mature in my age, and I don't look at my dad as somebody my dad has never been the kind of guy who I look to for advice or guidance or wisdom. He's the one who's always struggled with just trying to stay sober. So I had to learn that on my own, or from my mom, or from my grandfather. So it is difficult to just be his son and to let him be my dad. That's very difficult for me to this day. But I think it's not difficult for me to love him and to try and be the best example of Christ. 2 Corinthians says to be an ambassador for Christ when you walk with the Lord. I try to be the best ambassador for Christ that I can be when I talk to my dad. I fail at that. Sometimes those old feelings come out, but forgiveness is not an instantaneous thing that just happens. It's a daily dying to yourself. It's a daily request made to God. And I think when we realize that, we don't have to, be so hard on ourselves when we do fail, because we know God is still there, and we know He knows where our hearts are.
Yeah, there's some good wisdom in that, Jason. Thank you. But we are moving on, and I do want to talk about your Sports Spectrum podcast. So you gave up ESPN, and now you've carried on your love of sports, because you get the rich, the powerful, the famous, and everybody else from the sports world. Just tell us about the podcast.
Yeah, Sports Spectrum is just a dream, really, without even realizing it was a dream. I mean, I get to work with a media company that tells stories about sports, but tells stories about Jesus. So we're using sports, or the athletes and the coaches that we talk to ultimately hear their Jesus story. Just the way you asked me about my faith, I'm asking them about their faith. And those are questions, those athletes and coaches that I talk to, who don't get asked a lot of questions about their faith. That's just not how the mainstream media will ever work. And so we have a very unique space, I think, where we live with Sports Spectrum, where we can have these conversations like you and I are having right now about faith, about sports. And there's a lot of sports in most of my conversations with these athletes, because I'm a sports fan, but there's also a lot of faith. And it's, tell me how Jesus impacted your life. Tell me the struggles. Tell me the celebrations, the wins that you've had, and how Christ has allowed you to kind of walk freely in Him. And so that's what Sports Spectrum's about. It's been around for a long time, Sports Spectrum since 1985. But I'm now part of a team that can stand on the shoulders of others who started before us. And, we look at it as ministry. It's sports ministry, but it's also media. And so we kind of live in two different worlds, but the goal is always the same. And that's to keep Jesus in the sports conversation. And that's what we get to do.
I think it's great. I think I've been very fortunate as well with my podcast called the Godcast, is that I've managed to have some very famous British people, perhaps not so famous in the States, but some of the most famous people in the country, politicians, and have been on. And before I set it up, I wondered whether people would be open about a conversation about faith, because in the UK we're quite conservative to talk about these matters. And
Sure.
But it turns out that people do want to have a conversation, and even if they're atheists, they've got a view, they've got a point of view. Right. And I don't even think I need to ask you, Jason. It's a wonderful privilege to go into a space where the secular world often don't want to travel, and have some really good conversations about religion, about faith, about philosophy, and the meaning of life. And I get so much pleasure, and I'm sure that's the same for you, Jason.
It is. I love talking to people about faith, but not in a way where I'm preaching to them, or I'm trying to force my faith on them, or I'm trying to convert them, but just talking to people about what they believe. And most of the people I talk to are Christ followers, but I worked at ESPN for 17 years, and most of the people there, many of the people, were not. And so it allowed me to have conversations then and even now with people that might have differing views. But if we're all very, if we do it in a joyful way, in a loving way, I think most people are cordial enough to want to have those conversations if they know they're not, being shouted at or forced to believe or to think about anything. I mean, let's just talk to people and have conversations. I know in the United States right now, this is a struggle just to talk to people who might believe differently or think differently than you, because we automatically label them as the enemy. And it's like, no, we're all God's creatures. Like, let's all try to come together and have common ground somewhere and talk through things like this. And I wish there were more conversations. That's why I believe in what we do. And honestly, Alex, I'm really glad in what you're doing. I think that's important to have those conversations with people and go a little below the surface, go a little deeper in some of what we talk about. I think that's what I think most people desire, if I'm being honest.
Yeah. And where do you see the challenges for the States, Jason, in terms of the Christian faith in the UK and in much of Western Europe? Christianity is in decline. We have to be honest about that. Yep. And it's a weekly, daily struggle for us to tell people, to share, to let people in, let people give us a window into the life and what it's like to be a Christian. What's the issues in US at the moment?
Yeah, I think those same issues exist. I think, unfortunately, we've seen people use religion or faith or God or even Jesus to benefit themselves or to benefit their political ideology or to benefit their side, which automatically pushes people who might not believe away. And we've seen, the decline in this sort of postmodernism of secular America happening. But I also have hope too. Jesus said his church is going to go forth and he calls us to make disciples. And I have hope. I mean, I love the church body that I'm a part of here in Connecticut. And I see people every day with a hunger and a desire to serve God. And I see people who are coming into faith as a new thing for them. And they're not sure where they're going or what they believe. But guess what? I was that guy too, 22 years ago when I was 27 years old. And I think that's wonderful. Like just having like I said, having those conversations, it gives me hope because I think most people deep down have a yearning for something bigger than themselves, for a purpose bigger than themselves. I think most people default, if you will, to prayer and to, seeking a higher power, if you want to use that word, seeking God when things don't go well. Most people, not everybody. So in that respect, that's where I think we can be a real asset to talk to others about these matters before they have to go into those moments of deep despair or sadness and, desperation in many ways. So I'm hopeful. There are moments when I'm not, and then there are moments when I am. I try not to pay attention to the political climate or to, the news, because I think it often portrays negativity and, the end of the world, if you will. But I think if you go deep down into the roots of people and attend some of these churches and even just talk to some of the people on the street corners, I think there's a yearning and a desire for something bigger. I really do.
I do too. Jason, it's been brilliant talking to you. Just quickly on the Yanks are coming to the UK, that's for sure, in terms of our national sport, which is soccer. Now, I know it's not your favoured choice of sport per se, but we've got some big stars like Tom Brady's just invested in Birmingham City, and JJ Watt, who to be honest, I'd never heard of him, but is a major American soccer player, invested in my own team, Burnley. What is going on? What is the attraction of British soccer to American superstars?
So you're going to laugh at me when I give you this answer, but I really believe this. Have you seen the show Ted Lasso on Apple?
I've heard all about Ted Lasso. I can't get it on my telly at the moment. I need to, but yeah, go on.
Oh, it's in America. It's on Apple TV here in America, and it's about this country Southern guy going into this English world and becoming a coach for a soccer team, for a football team. And I think a lot of people have watched that show and become really intrigued by the world of soccer, by the world of football and international football. And for me, like I said, it's not that I'm not a fan. I just don't know the sport well. I don't know the players, the athletes really well. But I was intrigued in watching Ted Lasso on how some of these clubs work and the fandom, and it's very similar to the States with American football or, American baseball and how clubs are run, but it's a different level of, I think, fandom. And that's what I think. I'm not saying Tom Brady or JJ Watt chose to go into these worlds of soccer because of Ted Lasso, but I do think there became this sort of intrigue that took place in America when we were watching a show like that. And the show does a really good job, I think, of portraying what it's like to be involved in a soccer club or a football club in the UK. It does a really amazing job. So that I think is probably one of the reasons. I also think, I think soccer is becoming more popular in America. Let's just speak truth. I mean, I think, especially
with trajectory, you've just got the world's greatest player, Lionel Messi.
When Messi comes to America, and now you're starting to see eyeballs on a guy who it would be like if Michael Jordan went to play professionally, in Europe for a year or two when he was at the height of his game, or even Tom Brady, right? So when you get a guy like Messi, oh my gosh, like that speaks to the level. And first of all, he's dominating. He's doing great, which isn't surprising, but that's a lot of eyeballs in our country to watch a sport that has taken a long time to become more mainstream. But I can tell you just from my friends and their kids, like soccer is one of the five now, if you will. You know, he's talking about baseball, basketball, football, hockey in America. Soccer is right there. And a lot of these kids are playing soccer and watching guys like Messi. I mean, I have a church family that I go with here in Connecticut that loves soccer. Went to my first professional soccer game a couple months ago here in Hartford with the club here in Hartford, Connecticut. And so that was wonderful for me to experience that and see the level of athleticism, the level of competition, but the fandom. It's wonderful. I love passionate fans.
Yeah.
But I also am one of those guys now, the older I get, Alex, where I don't want to take sports too seriously, because I was that guy and I would let my whole week be in full depression mode if my team lost. I know that's how it is in the UK with soccer for sure, but I'm a little less, I don't know. I'm still a fan. I still love my teams, but I can't let that ruin my week. I just can't. I have too many other important things to worry about.
I wish I could say the same. I mean, I know I shouldn't, but I am a big fan of Burnley, and just for people who are listening in America, Burnley have just gone back into the Premier League, so they're in the elite league now with the Liverpools and the Manchester United. So it's exciting times, and the fandom, the experience is fabulous. It really is, and it's an escape for me as well. So it's
on my bucket list, Alex. One day I want to come to the UK. I want to come to the UK just in general. I want to go to England. I want to go up to Liverpool and see where the Beatles were. I want to do the whole sort of holiday out there. But I would love to go to a soccer game or a football game, you know, in the Premier League of some sort, and just watch and just experience what it's like. I would imagine it would be incredible.
Yeah. Well, Jason, that's a lovely way to end the Godcast. Just promote your wares once more, your podcast to our listeners, and we'll say goodbye.
Yeah, so it's a Sports Spectrum podcast. It's on Apple or Spotify or wherever you want to listen to your podcasts. It's online at sportspectrum.com, which is our website, sportspectrum.com. And then, you know, there's stories updating every day. There's different devotionals and different features on athletes. And then I'm on social media. You and I found each other on Twitter, X, whatever it's called now, but there in the Twitter world. I'm also on Instagram and love to connect with anybody listening.
Fabulous. Jason, it's been great. For people who might want to catch up on the Godcast, I'm a one-man band, although I do have Jesus with me, which is always a benefit. And you'll catch lots of British sports people there, politicians, TV celebs, you name it, they're all there. But Jason, for now, thanks for your time and thanks for coming on the Godcast. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. I appreciate it.